They promise healing, enlightenment, the secret to a better life. But what if behind the smiles and supplements, there's money, lies, and misinformation? In this video, an investigative journalist and a doctor uncover the darker side of today's booming health and spirituality industries, from organ trafficking to internet gurus to the dangerous line between inspiration and exploitation.
Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're jumping into a stack of sources that kind of pull back the curtain on something really relevant right now. Uh, the complex relationship between health information, personal influence, and, well, the challenge of figuring out who and what to trust.
Exactly. We've got some fascinating stuff here, really rooted in investigative journalism.
Yeah, looking at everything from these surprising historical black markets all the way to the massive booming world of health and wellness influencers.
That's right. Our source material today really centers on a conversation with an investigative journalist, Scott Carney. His work has taken him into some, let's say, unexpected and sometimes pretty uncomfortable places. It gives us a really deep look at how information and, sometimes misinformation gets spread and the motivations, both good and bad, behind the people sharing it.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack all this, pull out the most important insights from these sources, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of the forces at play. The forces that shape who you listen to when it comes to your health. Get ready, because there are some eye-opening facts and definitely plenty to think about. So the source material starts by diving into the background of this journalist, Scott Carney. And what's immediately striking is his connection to medicine.
Right. His family history, it goes back, 4 generations in medicine?
Yeah, his great-grandfather was actually a surgical pioneer, did the first hiatal hernia surgery in America, apparently.
Wow. But despite that, he took a different path academically, got into anthropology.
Focusing on the medical and cultural sides of things.
Exactly. And that curiosity, that anthropological lens, led him into some pretty intense early investigative work. His very first major deep dive, organ trafficking.
And this is where the source gets, well, incredibly dark. He talks about traveling the globe, investigating the buying and selling of human organs.
Yeah, some shocking details. He uncovered this widespread organ removal happening en masse for decades in India, kidneys specifically.
Taken without the patient even knowing, and sold locally.
That's what the source describes. And he also dug into the history of the skeleton trade, which is just hard to fathom today.
It really is. Until 1980, Calcutta was the world's major supplier, exporting 60,000 human skeletons a year.
60,000 annually to medical schools all over the world.
That number is just staggering. And the source reveals something even more disturbing within that trade.
The child and fetal skeletons.
Right. Finding large numbers of them suggests it wasn't just about, harvesting from people who died naturally.
No, the demand for those specific bones, they fetched a higher price. It strongly points towards potential murders just to supply that market.
Horrific. It's a grim illustration, isn't it? How that demand, often fueled by colonial legacies and huge economic gaps, led to just terrible exploitation.
Definitely. And he contrasts that global picture with things that happened historically in the U.S., like anatomy riots and skullduggery.
Grave robbing.
Yeah, grave robbing, which were real events driven by the need for bodies for medical schools back then.
Sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it actually happened. Okay, so let's bring this closer to home. Address a fear people might still have, maybe especially here in the U.S. This myth that if you're an organ donor, hospitals won't try as hard to save you. Does any of this grim history lend any weight to that fear today?
Well, based on the source and just how the U.S. medical system is set up now, that fear is really unfounded. The source is clear. There are incredibly strict protocols. The organ procurement team, they're not even allowed near the patient until doctors have officially, formally pronounced death. There's a total separation.
Right. So Scott Carney's point seems to be well, technically anything's possible statistically in a U.S. hospital.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinarily unlikely, like getting struck by lightning, he says.
Exactly. But, and this is important, the source does stress that the international organ trade is still very real. It's ongoing.
But not the sensationalized tourist wakes up in a bathtub of ice myth.
Generally not, no. It's primarily about exploiting the desperately poor. People offered maybe, $500, maybe up to $2,000 for a kidney. It really preys on that huge gap between places with world-class medicine and areas with extreme poverty. The source mentions examples like tsunami refugee camps or historical practices in places like China with executed prisoners, or Pakistan.
So while the really extreme stuff isn't the reality here, the global picture of exploitation is much, much darker.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did investigating something that intense, that far-flung, eventually lead him to focus on health influencers? People much closer to home.
Yeah, it's quite a pivot. According to the source, there was a specific, very tragic catalyst. After he led a meditation retreat in India, one of his students died by suicide.
Oh.
And that devastating event prompted him to start investigating spiritual leaders, gurus, cult dynamics. He actually calls himself the anti-cult guy.
Mhm.
So that work, looking at charismatic figures and how their influence works, created a kind of direct pathway to understanding similar dynamics playing out in the wellness world.
And that pivot brings him into contact with figures like Wim Hof. The source says Carney initially saw that photo, Hof on an iceberg, and actually intended to debunk him.
Yeah, started as a skeptic, but then he ended up getting quite involved, didn't he? Helped Hof rise to fame, even practices the Wim Hof method himself, the breath work, the ice baths.
Right, went from skeptic to participant,
Mhm.
even promoter in a way. But the core insight here, according to the source, is how fame and money started to impact Hof's original, maybe positive intentions.
Exactly. After about a decade of involvement, Carney started tracking deaths that could potentially be related to the method, and he found 32.
32 deaths.
Yeah.
That's a serious number. What was the specific danger the source highlighted? How are these happening?
The source points squarely at the danger of Wim Hof, frequently showing his breathwork being done in water, in pools or ice baths. The method involves intense hyperventilation followed by breath holding. This drastically lowers CO2 in your blood.
Which does what exactly?
It can cause blood vessels in the brain to constrict. That increases the risk of blacking out, especially when you're holding your breath.
And if you black out in water?
You drown instantly. Even if the safety instructions mention doing it on land, the visual presentation is often in water.
So the visual appeal, maybe for social media, becomes this huge hazard that potentially overrides the safety message.
That's the implication. And the source notes the organization often tends to blame rogue agents or instructors doing it wrong, rather than fully grappling with the risk inherent in how the method is often presented to a wide, unsupervised audience.
What about the actual science behind it? Did the source touch on that? You mentioned preliminary research.
Yeah, it does. It discusses some early studies, like the endotoxin experiment. That one suggested people might be able to consciously influence their immune response using the method. Scott Carney kind of grades this underlying science as maybe a B+, meaning, okay, promising, worth exploring more, but definitely not the kind of solid, replicated research you'd need for broad clinical claims.
Okay, and this seems to be the critical point the source is making, right? That leap from B+ preliminary stuff to becoming a guru and building a huge business around it.
Precisely. That's the aha moment the source really flags. Taking those early findings and just running with them, building a massive personal brand, monetizing it heavily, often skipping right over the slow, careful validation process that traditional medicine requires.
Why does that happen, according to the source?
Well, it suggests it's partly fueled by the obvious financial incentives, but maybe also a lack, perhaps, of institutional structures within traditional healthcare that know how to properly value and support these kinds of preliminary explorations without, overhyping them immediately.
Did the source mention any other potential risks, physiological ones, from the method itself?
Yes, a couple of things. The heavy breath work, even done safely on land, might potentially lead to tinnitus for some people, that persistent ringing in the ears.
Okay.
And it can also apparently worsen anxiety. While some people find it calming, hyperventilation is actually a core symptom of a panic attack. So for certain individuals, doing that intense breathing can paradoxically trigger or increase panic symptoms.
And maybe the biggest concern mentioned is when people choose these methods instead of getting conventional medical care for serious conditions.
Absolutely. The source flags this as a major danger zone. It uses the example of Wubbo Ockels, the Dutch astronaut. He had cancer and reportedly went all in on the Wim Hof method shortly before he died.
You can't say for sure it changed the outcome, but
But it highlights the risk, right?
yeah.
That people with serious illnesses might abandon treatments that are proven, based on advice from their doctors, in favor of these unvalidated wellness solutions. The huge takeaway there is always work with your doctors. Don't replace them.
The source also pointed out a common tactic he observed in the wellness world, this idea of a truth wrapped in a lie. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, it's an interesting framework. It's like you start with something that's basically true and valid. For instance, acknowledging that big pharma, definitely profits from chronic illness and sometimes lacks transparency. That's a fair criticism.
Okay, so you start there.
Right. And then that valid truth is used as leverage to build these huge, sweeping conspiracy theories that basically dismiss all of conventional medicine and science and position the alternative wellness thing as the only real truth.
So the initial relatable truth makes the later, maybe less credible claims seem more plausible.
Exactly. It's like the credibility of the first part rubs off on the second. And the format of social media really seems to play into this. Well, social media thrives on short-form content. It pushes us towards wanting certainty, quick answers, thinking fast, as Kahneman would say. And that landscape just heavily benefits people offering simple, definitive solutions, which, as the source points out, is often the polar opposite of how actual medicine works, which is usually nuanced, complex, and involves a lot of uncertainty.
Let's dig into some more specific examples the source brings up. Building on this idea of maybe overly simple answers, Gary Brecka gets mentioned.
Yes, he's cited as an example of someone offering these very confident, simple cures that kind of bypass all the necessary medical nuance.
Like what?
Well, the source uses the example of him suggesting pink Himalayan sea salt as a fix for headaches.
Right, and headaches can be caused by a million different things.
Exactly. Dehydration, migraines, tension, eye strain, or sometimes, much more serious underlying issues. A single blanket answer like pink salt completely misses what clinicians call differential thinking. That whole process of considering all the different possibilities before landing on a diagnosis or treatment plan, it lacks that critical thinking step.
Okay. Then there's David Sinclair. He's different, right?
Yeah.
A respected Harvard scientist in the longevity field.
Right, very prominent. The source talks about his early work on resveratrol. Remember that? The stuff in red wine.
Vaguely, yeah. Big buzz around it for a while.
Huge buzz. His animal studies showed promising results for longevity, and that led to this massive acquisition. GSK, the pharmaceutical giant, bought the company holding the intellectual property for $720 million.
$720 million. Wow.
Oh.
And the source had an interesting behind-the-scenes detail about that deal.
Yeah, it's secondhand from Scott Carney's source, but intriguing. The suggestion was that within GSK, it was actually the marketing team pushing hard for the acquisition.
Overriding the scientist.
Apparently overriding the scientific team's concerns that Sinclair's results weren't replicating well, especially not in humans. It points to this sort of venture capital mindset, right?
Looking for the big win.
Yeah, seeking those exciting Hail Mary results. Compelling stories for investors, even if the really rigorous science wasn't quite there yet. And GSK ultimately lost that massive investment when the resveratrol research didn't pan out clinically.
So after resveratrol hit roadblocks, the source says Sinclair pivoted to NMN.
Right. NMN was then presented as the next big thing for longevity. And the observation from Carney's sources was that it felt like the same grift, meaning the same pattern, selling hope, capitalizing on that fundamental human desire. The problem is we're all going to die, and offering this potential solution.
Andrew Huberman is another huge name the source discusses. Notes his pretty meteoric rise.
Yeah, significant reach. The source points out his initial academic focus was actually narrower basic neuroscience, ophthalmology. But as his fame grew, his platform and the range of topics he presented as expertise broadened considerably.
The source mentions the personal stuff, the scandals reported in the press,
Yeah.
but focuses more on the impact of his platform, right? The health advice itself.
Exactly. While acknowledging the reporting on his personal life, the core critique in the source material is about his specific health recommendations and platforming choices.
And was there a specific recommendation that the source singled out?
Yes. His advice on using ice baths, specifically to induce shivering for weight loss. The source critiques this as potentially misguided and maybe even harmful.
Why harmful?
Because the often discussed benefits of ice baths, especially for things like anxiety or mental resilience, are usually linked to achieving mind over matter relaxation, learning to control your physiological stress response. Deliberately shivering does the opposite. It increases stress hormones like cortisol. The source suggests it might be a misapplication of concepts like brown fat activation or non-exercise thermogenesis, but it skips over critical nuances and could just create an unpleasant counterproductive experience for people.
And the source used a specific case involving Huberman and ice baths to illustrate a broader pattern.
Right, the case of Susanna Soberg. Huberman featured her small study on ice bathing and brown fat activation. Her results were unusually high, like 600% higher energy burn than previous research.
Okay.
And the source notes Huberman was actually on the editorial board of the journal where her paper appeared, right on the cover. After this exposure, Soberg reportedly left her academic career to sell ice bathing courses, charging a significant amount.
So the pattern is.
According to the source, it illustrates this concerning pipeline from preliminary, maybe questionable science, boosted by a major influencer's platform, who might even have ties to the journal, leading directly to the scientist monetizing those findings through courses, by passing further validation. It involves multiple players, the influencer, the scientist, the journal, the audience, all kind of feeding into this rapid commercialization.
Peter Attia is another one. Well-known doctor in the longevity space. How's he discussed?
The source acknowledges his popularity, and importantly, that most of the information he shares actually aligns with standard medical consensus. But it contrasts his very high-cost concierge medical practice, potentially involving extensive, expensive testing, maybe $100,000 a year, with, say, standard community health practice, like your own experience.
So the critique isn't just the price tag.
Not entirely. It also questions that little bit of his advice, the stuff that might be driving his popularity, but maybe lacks the same solid evidence base as the rest. The source wonders if the unique, perhaps less proven aspects are what create the buzz.
And the source connects this back to his background in financial incentives.
Yeah, Scott Carney points to Attia's background, including time at consulting firms like McKinsey as maybe influencing his business-oriented approach. The Aura Ring lawsuit is also mentioned as potentially shedding light on financial motivations and how studies might be used for marketing.
But Attia discloses his relationships, right?
He does, and the source notes that's good. It's important transparency. But the argument made is that disclosure doesn't magically remove the inherent conflict of interest when doctors stand to make millions from the advice or products they promote. It just raises questions about how those incentives might, even subtly, shape recommendations.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. AG1, the green powder supplement, often linked with Gary Vaynerchuk. How does that fit in?
The source presents AG1 as another case study, this time more focused on the business model and marketing. It gives some background on the founder's history.
Which includes?
Includes a conviction for unfair trading and fleeing trial in New Zealand before he found success with AG1 in the US, where supplement regulations are, well, much looser.
And the business model itself.
The core insight highlighted is paying influencers, often very heavily, to promote the product. The source really emphasizes that in this kind of model, the recommendations you see are clearly being driven by large financial payouts rather than necessarily being based on unbiased scientific assessment or deep personal conviction about the product's unique benefits.
So, moving beyond individuals, the source also points fingers at broader systemic issues, including universities.
Yeah, this is something Scott Carney is apparently actively investigating now. The source describes a pattern he sees particularly at big-name institutions like Stanford and Harvard.
What's the pattern?
Forming partnerships with venture capital firms based on exciting but often preliminary, sometimes really unfinished scientific research.
And the concern is?
The concern raised is that this basically amounts to selling hope to investors, attracting them with buzzworthy early results that can generate lecture tours and media attention even before the science is fully baked, rigorously validated. The source suggests institutions might profit significantly from the sale of these intellectual property companies built on that early science, citing, for example, the possibility that Harvard got a substantial cut from that Sinclair GSK deal.
It's compared to overscanning in medicine.
Yeah, like doing too many scans and finding lots of false positives. The idea is that commercializing preliminary findings too early before they're thoroughly vetted might actually cause more harm than good in the long run by misleading investors and the public.
The source also contrasts the ethical standards, influencers versus traditional journalists.
Right. A key point is the lack of those traditional ethical guardrails for most health influencers. Journalists usually have strict rules against taking money from the people or companies they cover to maintain independence.
Whereas
Influencers often operate entirely differently. Their business model frequently relies on paid promotions, sponsorships, affiliate links. There are no industry-wide rules against it. The source suggests that influencers who genuinely want to provide credible health information might actually benefit from, say, taking journalism ethics courses, just to understand the different ways bias, especially financial bias, can creep in and distort the information being presented.
And finally, Scott Carney reflects on his own potential biases in all this.
Yep. Yeah, he's quite open about it. Acknowledges that his past friendships or connections, like with Wim Hof or Andrew Huberman, likely influenced his earlier perspectives and maybe made it harder at times to prioritize purely journalistic ethics over those personal relationships.
He mentions a specific comment from Huberman.
Something to the effect of Huberman saying he didn't want Carney's investigative work to get in the way of their friendship. It highlights that tension. The insight, really, is that while personal experience can offer valuable perspective, it's crucial for both the journalist and us, the audience, to be aware of potential biases. He tries to be conscious of his own and thinks readers should always factor that possibility into how they evaluate any reporting. This whole deep dive really throws into sharp relief how complex it is to navigate health information today. As a clinician, I know firsthand how tough diagnosis can be, even with patient right there, all their history, labs. Trying to diagnose personalities or motivations just from public information, figuring out if something is a genuine mistake versus a pattern versus a character flaw. It's incredibly difficult, and we're all prone to our own cognitive biases when we try.
Yeah, absolutely.
Plus, people can have totally different experiences with the same public figure. And things change, right? Life events, health issues, maybe substance use the source mentions. These can alter behavior. So slapping simple labels on people feels really problematic.
The source does argue, though, that character can matter, that past actions sometimes are predictive risk factors.
He uses examples like, someone with a documented history of violence or someone who's repeatedly run financial scams, Ponzi schemes.
Right. Not saying people can't change, but
suggesting society maybe has a role in acknowledging risk based on past behavior. Even if it's not 100% predictive, certain patterns signal danger. And he makes the point that charisma often gets in the way of people doing that necessary due diligence.
in the source notes how much effort sometimes goes into hiding those problematic patterns or histories.
Definitely. And points out that people who try to bring concerns forward, the whistleblowers, often face serious backlash. Threats, lawsuits. You've experienced some of that yourself, right? When calling out misinformation.
It happens. Yeah. He also draws a line, though, between investigative journalism and just gossip.
Yeah, emphasizing that real journalism has to rely on facts. Stuff that can be verified, that holds up under scrutiny, maybe even in court. And while he admits perfect objectivity is probably impossible, acknowledging his own biases, the goal is fairness. He urges listeners to look at the evidence, the patterns of behavior, not just react based on personal feelings or those, parasocial relationships people form with online figures.
You mentioned the vetting for that New York Magazine article on Huberman.
As an example of that deep, rigorous fact-checking process that distinguishes serious journalism.
And it sounds like Scott Carney's main goal isn't just about taking down individuals, canceling them.
No, he frames it more as diagnosing the systemic problems, the issues these individuals might represent or worsen within science, within public health communication. And he believes tackling those problems needs more than just science alone. It needs that multi-pronged approach, science, medicine, journalism, because scientific data by itself doesn't always convince the public.
There's a sense of maybe challenge, but also a little hope in the source regarding these figures.
Yeah, he doesn't seem totally closed off to the idea of influential people finding a way back to credibility. He sees many as potentially impressive individuals who maybe got derailed by fame and fortune.
What?
But he notes that regaining trust would probably require admitting mistakes, owning failures. And that seems incredibly hard when you've built your entire brand on being the professor of certainty.
Right. That really resonates with the medical side you mentioned earlier.
It does. Because in medicine, good clinicians have to say, I don't know all the time. There's just so much uncertainty inherent in biology and disease. The source suggests, and I agree, that often the more you genuinely learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. But people crave certainty. Influencers often provide that symbol certainty, while good doctors have to offer nuance, probabilities, the uncomfortable truth of the unknown.
The source also had a critique about this whole push for over-optimization in health and longevity.
Yeah, it argues that approach often fails because it ignores a fundamental principle, homeostasis. The body is always trying to maintain balance, constantly trying to push every single metric to an extreme with supplements or intense protocols, kind of disregards that natural balancing act. The source suggests you can't just purchase good health by trying to perfectly copy the routine of some elite performer. Their genetics, their life context, their starting point, it's totally different from yours.
And fame itself is described as unnatural.
From a behavioral perspective, yeah. Managing your reputation when millions of people are watching and reacting is completely unlike navigating relationships in a normal-sized community. That constant, overwhelming feedback loop leads to this kind of dehumanizing oversimplification. People reduce you to easy labels, forcing you into that thinking fast, reactive mode.
He mentioned Huberman's analogy.
Yeah, about the internet sometimes feeling like it has borderline personality traits, extreme love one minute, extreme hate the next. And managing that kind of intense fame often requires deliberately limiting how much input you take in, just ignoring most of the noise to stay sane.
So, based on all this, how does Scott Carney ultimately define a grifter in this context? What are the key elements for him?
He seems to define it by a few things. One is disingenuousness tied to profit, and that profit could be financial or maybe even emotional, like status or adoration. Second is deception. That might be knowingly pushing something false, or maybe more commonly, overstating the evidence for something and then refusing to back down, just doubling down when challenged with contradictory data. He also connects it sometimes to really outlandish levels of profiting, and notes he tries to focus his critiques on those with massive influence, partly to avoid accidentally giving oxygen to smaller players.
And finally, the source really emphasizes that finding truth in all this, and it's not easy, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it requires challenging your own beliefs, being willing to admit you might be wrong about someone or something, and accepting that the real picture often isn't neat and tidy. It doesn't come from just one charismatic source. While Scott Carney acknowledges all the complexity and the human tendency to want to give people the benefit of the doubt, he ultimately argues that actions sometimes do require judgment, that assessing character based on patterns, while not foolproof, can be a valid way to assess risk. His stated goal seems to be diagnosing these underlying problems in the system, but also recognizing that even flawed figures might still have potential contributions to make. It's about sitting with that complexity.
Wow. Okay, that was a really comprehensive deep dive. We covered a lot of ground there, from in the extreme end of global black markets all the way to the really complex, sometimes pretty murky dynamics of influence in the online health and wellness world.
Absolutely. It really drives home how connected all these things are, doesn't it? How
Right.
history, money, fame, our own, basic human desire for easy answers, how all that can profoundly shape the health information that actually gets to us.
And it definitely underscores how challenging it is for you, the listener, just trying to navigate all that, figuring out who to trust, when you should be skeptical, how to weigh different kinds of evidence. It's genuinely harder now than it's ever been, I think.
So what's the takeaway for you? What does this all mean as you sort through this landscape?
Well, it means really cultivating a critical mindset. Remembering that preliminary science is just that it's a starting point, right? Not usually a finished product ready for prime time or mass marketing. And it means recognizing that real health journeys, they're complex, they often involve uncertainty, and they almost always benefit from guidance from trusted, trained clinical professionals. It means looking a bit deeper than just the compelling story or the charismatic person delivering it. Be mindful of the patterns. Where does your information really come from? And understand that even really good intentions, especially when wrapped in a super appealing package, can sometimes unintentionally hide underlying issues or lead to dangerous oversimplifications.
Okay, here's a final thought. Something to kind of leave you with, to mull over, drawn from the depths of these sources we've been discussing. We talk about this idea of people building huge platforms, making significant money based on information that is, let's be generous, preliminary, or sometimes maybe even misleading. Can figures who have profited so much from those kinds of claims truly pivot back? Can they become purely credible sources again? And maybe more importantly, how should you weigh their past actions and the real-world consequences of those actions against any new information they might present down the line? Is it actually possible in this context to fully separate the message from the messenger? Or are they perhaps irrevocably linked? Something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope these insights give you some valuable perspective as you navigate the health and wellness world, both online and off. Until next time.